back somewhere in the ballpark of the time of the Civil War, certain decisions of the Supreme Court allowed the progressive victimization of the consumer. The work ethic, if I lived in a small village in Germany, even today, or France, most places in Western Europe, including Great Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, and the butcher sold me a bad piece of meat, and I went back the next day and said, "This meat is tainted. Did you know that?" The butcher would say, "I'm sorry, I didn't. How much? Let's weigh it. Here's another piece of meat." Here in Iowa City, if you do that at Hy-Vee, you'll still get that kind of response most of the time. However, in the middle of the 19th century, the attitude of the relationship of the producer to the consumer shifted. Up until some unspecified time, the producer stood behind his or her product. Somewhere, and it was a very gradual shift, somewhere from the point of view of I'm responsible for my produce to the mindset of let the buyer beware. That mindset ran parallel to, and I will not claim it was directly connected to, but probably indirectly connected to the mindset that with each step of the pyramid, the producer of a good became more and more removed from social and moral responsibility for the product. So the buyer had to be careful of what he or she bought because the producer did not consider him or herself responsible for it. I'm going to ask here, what in the last, I can say it in the last 10 years, what in the last 10 years, in your opinion, is a remarkable example of a manufacturer separating himself from the responsibility of the consequences of a bad product? One among many stands out in my mind. I'm just hoping that it stands out in yours.
Nestle sold bad baby milk to some remember when that happened and tainted? But I don't know what the repercussions are. If they ever got something happened to them, I don't know. That was
in Iowa, there was those egg billionaires, and they actually got arrested, and then didn't they get pardoned recently?
Yeah, Postville, the chicken turkey factory.
Oh, there's that, yeah. But I was
Oh,
thinking
then he got
also
pardoned,
of
too.
this family, this father and son who had like the biggest caged egg production.
There are obviously a multitude. The one that sticks out in my mind is the intentional defrauding of purchasers of Volkswagen diesel cars.
Yeah.
And that was not at all accidental. They went out of their way to instruct their computer to provide fraudulent information when they were being tested. Would anyone here, even if they had the money, buy a Volkswagen diesel today? I wouldn't. Yet there clearly are enough consumers in the market that some people still will, which strikes me as madness. Why would you do business with a person with that kind of work ethic when there are other kinds? Now,
was it the Germans you're talking?
Yeah,
Germans
the
did it?
German director of Volkswagen approved the plan to have the computers of the Volkswagen diesel cars provide bad information so that they could claim that they were not only fuel efficient but friendly to the environment. They were lying both to the government and to the populace.
There was another company too. that just got-
Oh, the very fact that several were mentioned here, it is so commonplace that the hazard the producer has is not a financial hazard. Wells Fargo very recently was fined $1 billion with a B, $1 billion for some fantastically fraudulent bank maneuvers. The $1 billion is a small fraction of the money that Wells Fargo makes. None of the infractions of regulations or breaking of laws results in jail time for the producer. In which case, the fines are simply a cost of doing business. And if the cost of disposing of my waste product can be deferred to the city and I don't have to pay it, that's an externality, and that's to my benefit. That improves my business bottom line. So the businessman, whether we're talking about AT&T, whether we're talking about Monsanto, these corporations that absolve themselves of moral responsibility are participating in the destruction of, literally the destruction of civilization. A very good journalist, in looking at the decline of the West, has said we have a choice between barbarism and socialism. Barbarism, the law of the jungle, where I take care of my own, and in a somewhat larger sense, I may take care of the tribe that is closest to me, and everyone else is a fair game for being a victim. Versus socialism, where the society as a whole accepts some rational measure of responsibility for the weakest, the youngest, the oldest, the least capable of defending and supplying for themselves. It's the reason the Old Testament prohibits the large landowner from harvesting the grain that is closest to his fence posts, because the poor and the needy need to have some place to harvest the grain so that they can sustain themselves. Since the middle of the 19th century, the West in general and the United States in particular have been placing the ruling elite, call it the 1%, it's not really 1%. Let's take the statistics somewhat more seriously. It's the ruling elite of the 0.1% who own 33% of the wealth. I'm picking a number out of the hat, but the point is being made. The top 10% own 80, 90% of the wealth. And the 9% between 90% and 99% are well enough off that when the political pressure comes, they're going to vote with the 1%. They may be being shafted by the 1%ers, but they're not being tossed overboard like the really poor. And for the certainly since 1970, not only have the blacks been tossed overboard, that's a long-term standing situation, but so have the poor and working class whites. So have the poor single mothers. So have the veterans, as a matter of fact. The veterans are not getting anywhere near the quality of medical care. We are indoctrinated to support our troops, but our own government doesn't support our troops after they have hung up their khakis. So we are looking at a society that is consciously, but as quietly as possible, tossing a substantial percentage of the human population within their borders overboard. Now, we might ostracize them as saying they are illegal immigrants. We might also ostracize them by saying they're too lazy to get a job. We might ostracize them by saying they never even graduated from grade school. Why should I pay money to provide them with medical care? And as long as the ruling elites can get the 80%ers to side with them instead of the bottom 20%, the 1%ers are going to succeed in leading us. Now, in terms of the job of leading us, I want to show you another film. The job of leading American society got progressively easy when Louis Bernays started applying psychology to advertising, somewhere around 1915. Since then, psychologists have been analyzing the easiest ways of manipulating you and me. And here, this is not at all complete, but I want to show you a few of the techniques that are used. I am assuming that at least half of you folk at least have television sets. Is that a fair assumption? Okay. The rhythm of the flickering on your television set is quite consciously intended to place you in an alpha state trance, so that you are receptive to ideas and assertions. You are receptive to linguistic manipulation while you are in that alpha state. This gentleman got into the business of studying the generation of entrapping your brain waves so that you are susceptible to whatever form of manipulation.
I'm originally trained as an electronics designer. And in 1981, I had the privilege of landing a job at the university developing a TMJ research facility up in dentistry. Believe it or not, that's how I got into this. And in 1981, I developed my first neurostimulator, mostly for stimulating trigeminal nerve for relaxing the jaw, and then we started using it on the back and different muscles and so on. And that's how I kind of got into this whole thing. And as we know, everything what we're doing here is all about balancing arousal. The brain has a tendency to have either too much gas or no brakes. Either which way is often disastrous. And this technology, I really have come to believe in using it a lot for adjusting the gas or adjusting the brakes, as you would with neurofeedback or other techniques as well. I'm going to talk to you about audiovisual entrainment first. Audiovisual entrainment was actually first discovered in 1934 when Adrian and Matthews discovered that you could drive brain waves, alpha waves actually, above and below their natural resonant frequency with flashing lights. And then all through the 30s and 40s, there were dozens and dozens of studies done on flashing lights in the eyes and seeing what brain waves would do and all this kind of stuff. But no one linked the subjective effects of blinking lights and pulsing tones until actually 1955, when W. Gray Walters published probably the seminal study on about 10,000 different subjects, all about the visual hallucinations they had, the experiences, how they felt, all these different things at different frequencies, different waveforms, and so on. But some of the interesting stuff, though, that really spawned out of this was this machine here, which was released in 1958 called the Brainwave Synchronizer. And it was a good piece of Frankensteinian kind of lab gear. You could unscrew this front panel here. It says a delta and alpha beta range. You could unscrew it and put your clients in one room and you're in the other room, turning the little dials and having them feel all, nervous. And this was a spin-off from William Kroger's work. William Kroger was a physician with the U.S. military. And it was his job to find out how come on a battleship, this is the Second World War, by the way, how come on the battleship or on a bomber plane, They completely drove into enemy territory, and suddenly the enemy's shooting bullets and bombs at them from all directions, and they should have seen it 20, 30 minutes ago on the radar, except that the radar guy was in a trance. And those old flash and blip type radars with a little blinky light was trancing these guys out. And he then linked that with the photic driving technique that had been discovered by Adrian and Matthews, and teamed up with Sidney Schneider of the Schneider Instrument Company in Illinois and said, well, let's build a machine and we can actually put people in states of hypnotic induction. And that was in 1958, and that's how this whole thing spawned sort of from a commercial level. And they did a number of studies in dentistry using hypnotic induction. They did gastrointestinal stimulations that could reduce anesthesia, because in the old days anesthesia was risky for major surgery. And that's where it all came. I got on board with this audiovisual stuff in 1984 when I was asked to design a machine to help performing arts students overcome stage fright. And that's how I got in. And over the years, I've designed all kinds of gear. You can see some of this stuff there. This is the first one I did, the big one. It was called the David 1. My name was David. I changed my name to Dave after, because everybody says, oh, David, you must feel pretty important about yourself. But really what happened is that the fellow I originally designed it for, he changed his mind about 15 times because he really didn't know what he wanted, the instructor in performing arts. So by the time it was all done, he owed me a fair chunk of money, and so he said, well, I can't afford to pay you, but I will name it in such a way that you'll feel honored. And I was thinking neurostim was what I wanted to call it, or hemisync or something like that. Anyway, he comes back with David, and I go, oh, geez, I could have thought of that, you know, just give me some money. And he said, well, no, digital audio-visual integration device. We're integrating brain waves with digital audio-visual stimulation. And I thought, well, he's not paying me anyway, and he put some thought into it, so I guess what the heck, we'll put the name on the faceplate. And when you silk screen stuff like this, you know, the first one costs $1,500. But you can run 100 of them for $1,800. So, of course, we ran off 100, which was good because I destroyed the first 5 trying to make the machine. And then the name kind of caught on, and Omni did an article on it. Some other magazines did articles on it, and it kind of became a bit of a household name, so we figured we better just leave it be. So, yes, everything is called, these are all called Davids now. Anyway, audio-visual stimulation is all about the thalamus. All of our senses except smell are routed through the thalamus. And the thalamus, as you know, is distributed throughout the entire cortex. There's fibers running both ways, and that's what gives us our alpha rhythm. It's a cortical thalamic loop. When we have nothing to do and we close our eyes, the cortex says, hey, how's it going? And the thalamus says, hey, I'm all right. How are you doing? Hey, I'm okay. How are you doing? I'm okay. How are you doing? And you got about 2 inches or so of space, and it takes 100 milliseconds roughly for that little loop to oscillate back and forth, which is 10 hertz. And we interrupt that with stimulation. And that's the whole idea. If you pulse tones into the ears, bump, 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 sounds, you get into the thalamus through the medial geniculate, and you start exciting the cortex with sound. And here's an example. If this is an oscilloscope tracing of that, it'd be bum, as it traced across, and you'd see about 10 milliseconds later there's this big on pulse in the auditory cortex from the excitation of the tone burst coming down the pipe. This is the world's biggest entrainment device, and costs billions of dollars. They're only made by the Department of Highways. And at about 60 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, those of you who are from Canada or other places outside the U.S., these typically go by at about 6 lines per second, and I've measured it in several countries. However, I was on the Autobahn once doing about 200 kilometers an hour, and they went by much quicker, and I did not get drowsy. So if it's at nighttime, of course, so you have a good, bright, dark contrast, and you're usually a little sleepy anyway, these can pull you into a theta state, and you can hallucinate and see a pink elephant, which might be a little giggly, or have a severe shock and see your mother-in-law on the highway, and suddenly, talk about a flight or fight response in the middle of the night, suddenly you wake up, anyway, and then now you're just on 18 cups of coffee after that experience. But basically, yes, you can get entrained off the highway, and it's called highway hypnosis. If you condense that down, so anyway, so I'll get to that. So it's flashing lights in the eyes, runs down through the optic nerve, end of the thalami via the lateral geniculate, and also fibers go back into the occipital cortex. And the rest goes into the neocortex and causes, of course, your rhythm to happen. Does that make sense so far? Cool. Okay, here's an example of Kinney's study in 1973 showing just that. The x-axis is 1 second across, and here they are flashing at 2 flashes per second. Now, we saw here that there's a 100 millisecond delay from the flash onset to the actual peak of the pulse back there, which, by the way, correlates with 10 hertz, natural alpha. We entrain best at natural alpha, although you can push people above and beyond, but you get your best results there. So here is at 2 flashes per second. Here's a flash right here. Here's the evoked response. At the half-second mark is another flash, and here's the evoked response. These are just visual evoked responses. There's nothing significant or wonderful or amazing about that. But when you're flashing at 4, flash, response, flash, response, flash, response, flash, response. Look at this now. If you put this on spectral analysis, you'd see there's a 4 hertz riding wave in there. There's some harmonics in this, partly because they're using a square wave. They're using a strobe light, which makes harmonics. Look at 8. Quite a nice waveform. Look at 12. Very, very nice. And here is 20 here. So you can instantly drive the brain into a state very quickly, within seconds in some cases. This is an EEG showing the distribution at roughly 8 hertz. And you can see the distribution is very broad, central, frontal, and parietal. And even prefrontal is very, very hot. It's almost maxed. And in this case, we're not using a sine wave, but we're using a modified square wave, which makes a second harmonic. And it shows up at 16. And we often use this type of waveform for enhancing cognition. But for meditation or relaxation, we use a pure sine wave because other waveforms generate harmonics. You don't want harmonics in the beta range when you're trying to meditate somebody. So we use sine waves for 10 hertz and under typically. Okay, this was Frederick, and he was a grad student of Lubar, and he did this study a few years back. And they just used 18.5 hertz off of the stimulator, and they measured it at the vertex. And they found that entrainment, eyes closed, photic entrainment, increased EEG by about 49%, which is pretty significant. Eyes closed, auditory entrainment increased EEG activity by about 21%. So it's about 2.5-fold in terms of the power of the lights over the audio. But here is one of the really fascinating things about entrainment that was missed for about 70 or so years, is that entrainment inhibits the half frequency of stimulation. I discovered this about 10 years ago or so, and not long after, so did Tom Kalura. And this is with BrainMaster. And Tom is using photic stim that's derived from an EEG in this case. So what he's doing, this child has a lot of 7 hertz theta, ADHD, right? So at roughly the 30-minute mark, he decided to inject 14 hertz flashing lights at 14 based on the double of the brainwave, the dominant brainwave. And as a result, within moments, inhibited all that theta. Very fast, very powerful. And we've been doing that for the longest time. We have several years ago, I think it was around 1999, we did a study on seasonal affective disorder. And people suffering from SAD make long, long trains of 10 hertz alpha. It doesn't really spindle. Well, their spindles are 10 seconds long. And it's associated with the lethargy and the grogginess and tiredness that they experience in the carbohydrate cravings to try to get out of that. And we gave them 20 hertz, and it was a highly effective study. And their carbohydrate cravings went way down, and they lost a significant amount of weight. Here is a technique that we use. If you do field stimulation, you can put a different frequency in each side of the brain. Because they're both fields A and fields B. So basically, the right arm we know goes to the left hemisphere of the brain. But the right eye does not. Right? It's the right fields of both eyes goes to the left hemisphere. and the left fields go to the right hemisphere through this network called the optic chiasm. So we got stimulus A, which is a fast stimulus, running through, hitting the left retinas, zipping down to the left geniculate and, of course, thalamus, and generating itself on the left side. Here's an example of a slower frequency, frequency B, going across to the right-hand side. And so you can actually do two different frequencies. Can you think of an idea where that might be kind of a good thing to have? Well, a few places are. Aside from doing a beta SMR approach for attention deficit disorder, depression, it can come in really handy. Here's a guy who has 8 standard deviations, hot in alpha, and 4 on the temporal on T3. Severe depression, and also has a lot of this beta associated with the anxiety. Couldn't wake up before noon for about 3 years of his life when he was in high school. One session of the beta, what's now called an alpha beta. So the idea is we're going to give him beta in both his right fields for his left brain to inhibit that alpha, to wake up basically his happy frontal lobe. And we're going to give him alpha on the left side. Not that he really needed it in this case, because it actually was quite in the hole, but that's what we did. And the idea is to keep the right side kind of sleeping, your fear, anxious side sleeping. And this is 45 minutes later. And you can see here, there's quite a difference, quite a reduction. And subjectively, he felt the lifting of the depression right away, within 45 minutes. Another thing is it dissociates people, and you can dissociate people who have all kinds of racy headedness going on. Anxiety of all kinds. You can shut that down. Depressives have terrible amount of race going on, and usually it takes about 5 minutes to dissociate them out of their sympathetic state. And you can get them parasympathetic pretty fast. And here's some examples of that. Well, first of all, we're going to look at the hypnotic trances. This was Kroger and Schneider, the guys who invented the brainwave synchronizer. And they found it using alpha stim with the synchronizer. In about 6 minutes, 78% of everyone they tried were in a hypnotic trance. And twice as many were in a deep trance compared to a light trance. So very fast. This was another little study done by Telch at the U of T in Austin, showing that when he looked at entrainment, these are good dissociators, these are poor dissociators. And he looked at entrainment versus dot staring or stimulus deprivation. That entrainment was more effective than those techniques. Then he did a second study. He's actually done 6 for us so far. And I'll show you his last study in a few minutes here. He did another study where he took people who had dissociative anxiety. You know, when they get dissociate, they get highly anxious because they're uncomfortable there. And so he designed a dissociative index, and he measured the dissociative anxiety just before and after he put them on the gear. And you can see he doubled their dissociation in 20 minutes. Because, well, the stuff's supposed to work, so it should dissociate you. You kind of drift into a hypnotic or like a meditative kind of a state. Normally it's blissful for everybody, but for these guys it's not. So their anxiety doubled as well. Well, if your anxiety doubles, what happens to your heart rate? Goes up, right? Heart rate went down. So even though they were subjectively experiencing anxiety, they were somatically calming, relaxing regardless. So he was really happy and excited about this, and has been using it as a desensitization tool on this group of patients since then. There's been a fair bit of work with it for dental hypnosis, and this is Margolis's study here. I'm only going to show you about a quarter of the stuff that's out there because there's just way too much to cover. This is Morris's study here, and you can see here what's the worst part of any dental procedure. It's the needle, yes, and you can see a heart rate of 107 while you're laying back in a chair. It's a little fast. If they run lights, it slows down to about 93. If they also played music, just music, to dissociate them further from the dental experience, they drop down to 85. It's not a dissociation in terms like an identity disorder or a pathological type of dissociation. It's like a meditative. As if you learn to meditate, how would you dissociate? You know, when you meditate, you kind of lose awareness of your environment and of your body and of your thoughts. That type of dissociation. And you'll see kind of what happens. It really affects the hypothalamus. Of course, the hypothalamus is what regulates all the autonomic stuff in our body. And either it does it directly, or it does it through the amygdala, or it does it through the cortex via the amygdala. Because if we think scary things or watch a scary movie, our hypothalamus really activates. So, and there is a little beast right there. So what would happen if we shut down the cortex in these anxious people? This guy here is an anxious guy, and this is blood, this is finger temperature. And you can see at about the 6-minute mark, when they're dissociating, hand temperature really starts to warm. And that's always a good sign. I use this with finger training because how many do temperature training? How many of you find that they often fail for the first 4 or 5 times and they get kind of hopeless and quit? Any of you had clients who've done that? I've had clients who've done that. If you use entrainment along with it, you can actually keep their fingers in a warming trend so they feel hopeful that they're not going to fail. And then you slowly weed the entrainment off as you do more and more sessions. I could share more of that with you later on. Here is skin conductance. And again, look.
I'm going to stop it there. His name, should you want to, let's see. I'm trying to. You can find this if you Google audio-visual brainwave entrainment. It's called lecture. I don't recall the gentleman's name. T as in Tom Hawes, Hawes. This was in 1996. Now, all of the applications that Mr. Hawes showed you are, in principle, beneficial. I will point out that if they can create a hypnotic state to help you be relaxed, and if 10% achieve a deep hypnotic state in being relaxed, it is precisely that deep hypnotic state that almost certainly was used for Sirhan and very possibly for the Sarnoff brothers over the Boston Marathon. The point that I am making is that for very evil and sadistic purposes, these very same techniques can be used. And much more important than for the major evil techniques, all of these techniques and a host of others have been developed precisely in order to complete your transition from being a human to being a consumer. In the middle of the 19th century, more or less concurrent with these other changes, forced public schooling was established, and parental control of the educational model passed from the hands of the parents to the hands of the state. First it was the local school board. The local school board lost authority out to the state school board, and the state school board lost authority out to the Federal Department of Education. If you read Charlotte Iserbyt on the deliberate dumbing down of America, if you read John Taylor Gatto, the secret history of education in the United States, something to that effect, you'll find out that our education is intended to create and produce a predictable product for society. So you as a human being are being modeled to be a useful product for society. And in this case, not even for society, but for the people who are making decisions for society. At the beginning of the 20th century, people who were all in favor of this modality of education were talking about and praising the benefits of controlling the human population in this manner. The name slips my mind, but somewhere along the line, one of the major endorsers of this technique discovered that in the process of creating a predictable product, they were reducing the human being from a multidimensional entity to a two-dimensional entity, and he got appropriately frightened and concerned and appalled by it. He happened to be one of the honest ones. Many of the dishonest ones found out, along with, in the last 20 years, journalists how beneficial it is to go along with the program. That process of creating a predictable and manageable product leads me to the last set of points that I want to make on this last occasion. In the last 5 years in particular, and in a more general sense in the last 20 years, Americans in particular, and the West in general, but Americans in particular, have been exposed to an information blitz that is genuinely appalling, in the sense that in decades past, the information you got, be it from the New York Times or from the American broadcasting system or from public television, had some semblance of honest reporting. Particularly in the last 5 years, there is virtually no correlation between historical truth as it applies to economics, history, and politics that has anything to do with genuine historical facts. Even journalists, a few, are commenting on the total divorce of the media from historical information. There is no shame being evidenced by the BBC or the New York Times promoting the stories that are put out by the federal government that have no root whatsoever in historical fact. No one is embarrassed at the multitude of inconsistencies with the Skripal poisoning. No one seems to be embarrassed at the multitude of inconsistencies about the so-called use of chemical weapons in Syria. I'm just picking two of a host. At the, I want to say Sunnybrook, there was a public massacre on the east coast of children, and a detective, a gentleman who makes his living analyzing school disasters and providing advice for schools in order to give them information wherein they can protect themselves.
Sandy Hook.
Sandy Hook, thank you, Dawn. He attempted to get the public records from the local United Way on the people who had supposedly died at Sandy Hook. And the sheriff's department prevented him from demanding the public record. Now, United Way, as a public agency, is obliged to show their records and books if they are asked for from the public. That agency received police protection so that they could avoid delivering useful information to this professional. Now, I have to ask you, what public service was served by preventing this person from investigating the people, the names of the people who died at Sandy Hook? Records about the destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, some of them are still secret. One has to entertain the possibility that their secrecy is not based on the public good, but on keeping embarrassing secrets unknown.
What would you theorize those to be?
I think people in the know with respect to Pearl Harbor, or with respect to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, might well discover the real motivations for dropping those two nuclear weapons, when the public motivation was to end World War II. It is clear from even the records that we have that Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew and expected the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet, the public myth on that is still very widespread. most important from this understanding of history is something that I learned just this last week. Going back not to World War II, but to World War I. And I'm using these major events to demonstrate what is delivered to the public as public history, or I'll use the word public myth, in contrast to actual history. At the end of World War I, massive amounts of primary documentation from Germany, from Belgium, the other participants, other European participants in World War I, were confiscated by the U.S. military headed by Herbert Hoover. Not that he headed the military, but he headed the project for collecting all of these primary documents. And they are squirreled away right now in some so-called educational facility in California. There's a similar, somewhat smaller facility north of London where many of the British primary documentation for World War I is squirreled away. When researchers attempt to access that, they discover two things. Their access to these documents is severely restricted, and as they achieve access to some of them, they discover that others of these documents have already been destroyed. That is, history is being literally dropped down Aldous Huxley's or George Orwell's memory hole so that the Western people cannot find out what actually transpired. One of the more interesting aspects of this, from my perspective, is if Western Europe is ever able to accurately reconstruct the history of World War II, Germany might find out that it was not the quintessential evil party in World War II, and the Zionists might discover that they have been duped by their leadership into thinking that they were victims rather than victimizers. Certainly after World War II, the Zionists benefited marvelously from the reparations that Germany has paid to the Zionist entity, and I'm not making any assertions that Hitler was some kind of hero. But the last German chancellor before Adolf Hitler told Winston Churchill that he found it interesting that both Churchill and Hitler were financially sponsored by European Jewish bankers. If we ever uncover real history for much of the 20th century, I think our understanding of our own history will change greatly. In terms of the United States, and especially since this is our last meeting, I personally think that Western civilization is in irreversible decline, and I want to offer some suggestions as to what members of this class can do to protect themselves. But I also want to point out that there are major aspects of the direction in which history is going, and if you recognize those aspects, you'll be prepared for what's going ahead. The two primary aspects that you want to be aware of. One is that the American government is controlled right now by Zionists and neoconservatives, as well as by what people call the ruling elites. These are not two clearly distinguishable parties. There's a phenomenal amount of overlap, but they are somewhat different in their goals. The ruling elite want to reduce the human population substantially. And it really is not very important to them whether that is reduced by famine, by war, by reduced fertility. It just is a matter of the goal is to reduce the human population so that the ruling elite can enjoy the wealth of the world without being troubled by supporting the rest of the human population. The Zionist goals share that, but they also want to see the Zionist state being preeminent in the Middle East. If the ruling elites could occupy Russia without the Russian people, they would do so in a moment. They can't. But any activity you see toward controlling Russia, toward reducing Russian influence, you can bet that that is largely controlled, largely motivated by those people who want to control Russian wealth. On the other hand, when you see people promoting war in Syria and in Iran, you can bet that the Zionists would love to have the United States fight a war on behalf of Israel. For yourselves, I think you need to learn how to weld, do simple carpentry, do simple electric wiring, grow your own vegetables, be friends with a few farmers, and do some walking. And I think we'll close it for today, Dawn, because my voice is starting to give out. But that information on World War I, when I discovered how widespread was the intent on hiding the activities of the British government, the American government, the Belgian government, the German government, the French government, American foodstuffs were being supplied through Belgium to Germany for the last 2 years of World War I. Germany would have had to give up. In the middle of 1915, Germany was in control and England was in a position where they would have had to give up if the United States hadn't joined the effort. By the middle of 1916, the United States was feeding Germany indirectly. And that intentional extension of World War II to make it last longer, the ruling elite did not want that to be made public. Some of you may remember that when the ruling elite were sending messages to Woodrow Wilson, one of their messages was, once we get into World War I, don't let it end too soon, because we want it to go on for a certain period of time. And by providing foodstuffs to Germany, Germany was suffering due to an embargo, as was England. And the embargo on Germany was interfering with the supplying of foodstuffs to Germany.
Was Hoover just the messenger, or was it his decision to hide certain negative information?
No, Hoover was a messenger. Hoover was the guy picked out as capable of doing the job. He was already in the military. He was picked out as a guy who was capable of doing the job, and he was told what job to do by people who are anonymous. Mm-hmm. The people who are anonymous, if we knew their names, would be very well known, but they choose not to be known. They choose to be private. Carroll Quigley described them as the people who are content with the reality of power rather than the appearance of power.
So is that why you can't find this book in the library?
Quigley's? Yeah. Quigley is an excellent historian, He's not the best writer. I'm working to, one of the most important books, and historian calls it, the most important book on the history of the 20th century is called The Anglo-American Establishment. Only read it after you've drunk, or start reading it when you drink 3 cups of coffee, because Carroll Quigley's style, especially on the early chapters, is less than stimulating. But he gets down to the nuts and bolts of the way the British and the American ruling elites really had the intention, and I think still do, of controlling the entire world economically and individual governments by controlling the politicians. The American CIA has already admitted, when one journalist was asking a CIA agent how they managed to get European governments to go along with American projects, the CIA agent said, we bought them. And as long as people are for sale,